On the common link theory, CLT. The esilentio argument was generalized by Juynboll and applied to numerous other instances of Ibn Hanbal's narrations. However, this generalization would only be valid if it was based on the premise that Abdul Razak had narrated all the hadiths mentioned in the Musnad of Ibn Hanbal. In order to validate this claim, Juynboll sought to prove it. However, he did not and cannot, because Ibn Hanbal's Musnad, after all, contains about 30,000 hadiths, while the Musannaf of Abdul Razak contains only about 20,000, clearly indicating that not all the hadiths in the Musnad are to be found in the Musannaf. Ibn Hanbal narrated about 10,000 hadiths that were not narrated by Abdul Razak. Consequently, Juynboll's assumption that any hadith narrated by Ibn Hanbal ought to be found in Abdul Razak's Musannaf is unwarranted, this carrying the strong implication that his conclusions are rendered suspect, including his highly questionable conclusion that Ibn Hanbal invented other strands of existing hadith. Another of Schacht's theories taken over by Juynboll was the family isnad. On the basis of the CLT and family isnad theories, Juynboll developed his Mu'ammarun theory, by which he argued that family members were invented to strengthen the supporting strand. Inventing the Mu'ammar and linking him to a transmitter related to the Mu'ammar by blood or Mawla status, and then in turn to a companion, and then finally back to the Prophet himself. This was supposed to strengthen the isnad and make up for its isolated nature. Referring to this theory, Juynboll states, strands of this sort could only with some justification be called variants of the family isnad phenomenon that was coined and studied by Schacht. Juynboll's wider definition of the Mu'ammar concept was thus applied to all isnads and was not limited only to the family isnad. The construction of the Mu'ammar theory was based on the common link theory in particular and the nature of the transmission of traditions in general. This was explained by Juynboll as follows. Canonical Muslim tradition literature is first and foremost characterized by the feature that the transmission of a particular saying allegedly uttered by the Prophet travelled during the first 60 to 150 years or so of its existence, along a path of consecutive single individuals. Only after having travelled along this path of single individuals does a sizable portion of isnads begin to branch out along various different paths to end up in different collections. The person who was responsible for inventing the Mu'ammar was, in each case, according to Juynboll, the common link, the CL. He states, sometimes this Mu'ammar was a historical person who claimed to have reached an advanced age, his claim being eagerly emphasized after his death by his pupil, the common link, who profited from his age. At other times, the Mu'ammar was a fictitious person, wholly invented complete with his allegedly advanced age at death by the common link who pretended to have heard his traditions. He also insists that, at this point in time, the transmission of hadith, the common link of a saying that he wanted to ascribe to a prophet, had to provide a chain of authorities bridging a time span of at least 60 years or longer. In such a case, authorities who had supposedly reached a considerable age at the time of death were found easier to link than authorities whose ages spanned only a few decades. In addition, he states, the city of Kufa appears to have been, unlike other centres of hadith, teeming with hadith transmitters who had reached very advanced ages at death. As a result of the need to support the single isnad, Juynboll states, we witnessed the emergence of hordes of traditions, especially supported by single strands with Ibn Mas'ud in the companion's position, with the figure between Ibn Mas'ud and the CLS a number of long-lived successors, who later came to be called Mu'ammarun. Mu'ammarun can be divided into historical and fictitious personalities, depending on the amount and the feasibility of historical data concerning their lives presented in the early historical and biographical sources. The influence of Cook's analysis and understanding of the development of the isnad is obvious here. For instance, in the use made by Juynboll of Cook's model where one of these common links simply copied the other, making use of the other's authority at the same time. Likewise, principles introduced and advanced by Cook in his early Muslim dogma were acknowledged and used by Juynboll, such as the principle of Cook, the principle that Cook used to account for the proliferation of isnads. Let us visualize a transmitter. we call him A, who has heard a tradition transmitted by one of his fellow traditionists called B, and corroborated by one of B's sheikhs. Having taken a fancy to that tradition, A simply wants to bring it into circulation, but he does not simply go to B to hear it from him. That would mean giving all the credit to his colleague, who may be a mere contemporary, or what is worse, even younger. No, A wants some credit for himself and invents his own isnad, preferably one with a master who is not at the same time in B's isnad. This model constructed by Cook may in fact have occurred on a considerable scale, and it was certainly a cause for some proliferation of isnads. To understand Juynboll's new terminology, our next task is important to remember that his conclusions on dating the beginning of isnad formation to the late 70s of the first 7th century. This is clear from the 9 technical terms he later expounded upon to describe how the CLT functions. The first of these 7 features. 1. Common link, CL, representing the point at which he names its isnad starts fanning out in branches. 2. PCL, partial common link, derived directly from the first one, refers to transmitters who receive something from a common link or any other sort of transmitter from a generation after the common link and pass it on to 2 or more of their pupils. 3. Seeming common link, SCL, is similar to the common link when the number of PCLs of a CL is limited. Juynboll would rather speak of that common link as a seeming common link. A seeming common link may emerge in bundles. These bundles, upon scrutiny, turn out to be 2 or a few single strands of what happen to come together in what looks like a CL, but which is, in lack of PCLs, not a real CL. Juynboll provides Nafi' as an example of this term. Nafi' in the isnads of the canonical tradition literature constitutes a well-nigh perfect example of a seeming, or depending upon one's outlook, an artificial common link. 4. The isnad bundle. All those partial common links together constitute the 4th term, the so-called isnad bundle. 5. The knot. Applied in the following case: the more transmission lines there are that come together in a certain transmitter, either reaching him or branching out from him, the more that moment of transmission resembles what may be described as a knot. 6. The inverted partial common link, IPCL, describes a transmitter who is represented in a bundle as having received a report from 2 or more authorities, which he would pass on to 1 or more pupils, whereas Bukhari, for example, is represented by only single-strand transmitters. Muslim would be an inverted PCL if he gathered up the strands issuing from the same transmitter. This term is derived ultimately from the 2nd term, PCL. And the 7th, the single strand, SS's, which as the name indicates involves linking just one master with one pupil and so on, and can be traced over a period of 200 years. Juynboll states that the single strand cannot claim any measure of historicity. It is in all likelihood the handiwork of collectors in whose collections it found a place, or the handiwork of the direct informants. 8. The spider, which occurs when several SS's seems to come together in an SCL that does not require a minimum plausible number of PCLs. 9. The diving strands. The newly coined term introduced by Juynboll is used for the strands supporting muttabi'at and shawahid as found in the books of Hadith. In addition, Juynboll introduces 2 more modified terms, isnad marfu' and madar. In Hadith handbooks, the former means a prophetic tradition, as opposed to a tradition extending back to the companions or the successors. Juynboll, however, failed to understand this term, assuming instead that the common link fabricated an isnad in order to give it more authenticity as follows. The single strand from the CL down to the Prophet does not represent the transmission path taken by a prophetic saying, a path which has a claim to a measure of historicity, but is a path invented by the CL in order to lend a certain saying more prestige by means of the first and foremost authentication device of his days, the isnad marfu'. In fact, ascribing the isnad to the term marfu' has nothing to do with the authenticity of the isnad. It is just an indication that it is a prophetic tradition. Rather, it lends prestige to the matan, the text. The madar, on the other hand, seems to be used ambiguously by Juynboll. Of all the scholars of Muslim tradition whose works Juynboll perused, At-Tirmidhi alone shows a keen insight into isnad strands, for he appraises the value of each tradition after presenting its isnad and matan in his Jami'. Juynboll states, The fact that the previously mentioned opinion of Tirmidhi about madar was vaguely recognized by Goldsihar but not elaborated upon to its ultimate consequences. I have the distinct feeling, no more than a feeling, for as of yet I have not been able to substantiate it sufficiently, that we, since Schacht now call common links, may have played a certain role in Tirmidhi's representation of the evolution of hadith. He may have referred to them as the term madars, pivots. I will come back to this idea in another publication. Comparing the finding of Western scholars with those of Muslim scholars, Juynboll claims that certain terms developed by Muslim Western scholars seems to have been equivalent to Muslim hadith books, and he cites the CL as an example of this, but he contradicts himself when handling the term madar, the pivot, which he claimed was synonymous with common link. He writes, however, reading between the lines, numerous Rajal works comprising references to weak, da'if, and pious Salih transmitters and their traditions, such as Ibn Adi's Al-Kamil and Abu Nu'aym's Hilyat al-Awliya, two of the best known of such works, dozens of times one comes across the word madar, turning point, pivot. To my knowledge, this term never turns up in the numerous Muslim dictionaries and handbooks of technical hadith terms, but in my opinion, it is unmistakable the Muslim scholars' equivalent of our CL or seeming CL. The earliest transmitter who I found to be associated with the term madar is Abu Aliya Rufay ibn Mihran al-Riyahi, who died in 93-712. Juynboll presumes that various important hadith scholars use the term madar in its specific sense of common link, stating the following: Dara ala, such an equivalent in the intransitive form tafarrada and infarrada, saying someone is the madar, the pivot of such and such a tradition, can also be put in the terms someone tafarrada or infarrada bihi. In other words, Juynboll suggests the term common link is equal to tafarrud. Yet Juynboll nor Schacht relates the ruling on tafarrud to the common link transmitter, as will be explained later. The third issue: how did Juynboll deal with these isnads that contradicted his own findings? Before proceeding to discuss this issue, one must acknowledge that there is a necessary relationship between Juynboll's views and his characterization of the prophetic tradition, in order to locate the reason for the contradiction between his theory and the case studies he provides. Juynboll claims that large isnads analysis has hitherto unearthed an unrecognized feature. Virtually all isnads listing the transmitters of a certain hadith from the Prophet, all the way to Islam's canonical hadith collections, have one striking characteristic in common. They consist of only one single strand of 3 or 4 or 5 transmitters after the Prophet before the transmission parts taken by the report start branching out in various directions along several different strands. In other words, the vast majority of isnads, for the sake of argument listed here as the beginning of the Prophet, read as follows: Muhammad, one companion, one successor, one later authority, the key transmitter, a number of pupils, and then various collections. This generalization, however, prevented Juynboll from understanding the structure of the several isnads that he studied in depth, leading him to proclaim that all the isnads have a common link, i.e. a fabricator. Because he held so firmly to this theory, Juynboll found himself puzzled by certain categories of hadith. The first of these were the isnads of hadiths related to the issue of saqaya, irrigation. After collecting and studying those isnads based on his understanding of the single strands, spread later by a common link, he concludes the saqaya reports are supposed by such a number of different isnads that it is impossible to point to a transmitter who might be considered as the common link. In fact, based upon the traditionist's understanding, the common link for these isnads is the Prophet himself. This, however, he could not see, for attributing the hadiths to the Prophet would give them full authenticity, an authenticity that contradicts completely the entire theory of Schacht. A diagram of this type of understanding looks quite different from the one proposed by Schacht, as cited above. The accurate diagram being like this: the Prophet, one or more companions, and from each companion, one or more successors, and from each successor, one or more later successors, then various collections. The second case of confusion is encountered in the same article when Juynboll discussed the hadith related to the meaning of uswatun hasana. He admits his inability to apply the CLT to this hadith. An analysis of the available isnads, including those of other variants, does not, however, enable us to determine a common link, who might have been solely responsible for bringing this report into circulation.